everyone. Welcome to the Advancing Workforce Equity Data Webinar Series. This is the second of the three. The title of this webinar is Analyzing Systemic Drivers of Inequity in Workforce Ecosystems. Next slide. My name is Michelle Wilson, and I'm the Director of Evaluation and Continuous Learning at the National Fund. And so as we get started, just a couple of reminders. If you need to pair your phone or mute. Okay, we can put the instructions in the link, but just, okay, here we go. So click to join audio in the lower left-hand corner, and then on your phone, there's a dial pad and you can enter the participant ID, the number that's there. Next slide. So again, I am Michelle Wilson, and I am your host for today, just for a bit, and I will turn it over to Abbie Langston, who will be leading this session. So welcome. So for those of you who joined us during the last session, welcome back. If you're new, we'll do a brief refresher on what we covered last week. So next slide, Jaya. So today we'll just a brief review of the National Equity Atlas, and then we'll launch into the factor analysis, talking about the story behind the data and how we use that. And then we'll have an exercise on a factor analysis exercise, and then we'll do a debrief, and we'll wrap up and just talk about how we will bring all of this into next week's final webinar. And so our objectives for today, next slide. So we want to talk about how we move from data to strategy and what we've identified as the components to building equitable workforce strategies, and how to identify these strategies in workforce systems, and how to use data to tell your story. So that is what we're planning on covering today. And so next slide. As a brief review, and Abbie can go into this as well too, but this she's on the phone, she's with us with PolicyLink, but we went over the National Equity Atlas, and if you haven't had a chance to explore that, we invite you to do that. It's a really great tool, but it really is a one-of-a-kind policy tool for community leaders and policymakers who are working to build an equitable economy that is both resilient and prosperous. We love it at the National Fund. We think it's a comprehensive resource for data to track and measure and make a case for racial equity. It contains a whole host of demographic data, racial and economic inclusion, and as it says here, it has the potential for economic gains from racial equity for the largest, it covers the 100 largest cities, 150 regions, all 50 states, and the United States as a whole. So it's a really great tool. It does a lot of stuff. And again, we did a deep dive last week. That webinar will be made available as part of the toolkit, which we will share with you next week, but you can also go to the National Equity site on PolicyLink's website. So that's there for you as well too. So next slide, because I think it also talks about, Abbie has put in here just some of the points about the Equity Atlas and what it allows you to understand how your community's demographics are changing, to assess the state of equity in your community based on where your community's diverse populations can participate in its economic vitality, and contribute to the readiness of the future. It builds a compelling narrative and shared understanding about why and how much equity matters. And lastly, it informs the development of policies, plans, strategies, business models, and investments to advance equitable growth. And so again, for the Advancing Workforce Equity Initiative that we just completed, this was the source of a lot of the majority of our work, in addition to some supplemental and necessary support from Burning Glass. But this is where we drew from in developing our strategies. So that's what I want to offer just in terms of the review. Reminder that in the final session that we will have a resource packet with all of this information. So everything that you see here and that you're getting here, you will have access to that in the last session. So with that, I will turn it over to dear Abbie. That was funny. I really just came up with that, and I probably just dated myself. But at any rate, dear Ba-dum-bum. Dear Abbie, I turn it over to you.
Thank you, Michelle. We'll take what we can get on a Wednesday. Hi, everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, depending on where you are in the country. Thank you for being with us. And before I get started, I'm wondering if folks could maybe just give me like a +1 in the chat if you did attend our webinar last week, diving into the atlas, or a yes, or yeah. Some sense of that. I know there are probably some new folks joining us, and that's totally fine. We're not going to leave you behind. Just wanted to get a sense of whether or not folks had that grounding. That's okay, no problem. So Jonathan, we can go to the next slide. And I wanted to start us today. In the last webinar, it was a lot of me talking about the National Equity Atlas, walking through the different indicators that we have available, how you can cut the data, how you can disaggregate it, just how to navigate through. So today we are planning to be a little more conversational, a little more interactive. We welcome self-dating jokes, for example, but really wanted to make sure that we're grounded in the sense of what's the point of this again? Why are we here? And so within the Advancing Workforce Equity Project, in our national report and in all of the work that PolicyLink does around this issue, we define workforce equity as a labor market in which racial income gaps are eliminated, all jobs are good jobs, and everybody who wants to work has access to employment that can sustain a family and a household. This is important. It's an important marker and aspiration. It's also really big. The definition alone gives you a sense that we are talking about systems level efforts, that there are systems and policies and dynamics that are driving the inequities we see, and we're going to have to get systemic about addressing them. So today we're going to really focus kind of on this top line: racial income gaps are eliminated, because in order to achieve income equity, you have to close racial gaps both in wages, right, where folks are being paid the same amount of money, and also in employment, because we know that those are two major drivers of the inequities that we see. So there are tremendous gaps just in who has access to work, period. And then among working people, there are tremendous gaps in terms of what they're paid. And so we want to talk through how do you take the data, start with the data that's available in the Atlas or anywhere else, and really dig in to understand what the systems are that underlie it. We're going to do an exercise called factor analysis, but it's the same idea as back mapping or as root cause analysis. So the idea is just to start with what the data is showing us and really think about what is causing this to be the case, and then how do we prioritize, where we want to make some interventions. Next slide, please, Jonathan. So when we talk about developing workforce equity strategies, this is an image that I borrowed from the Urban Institute, just to think about the complexity of what a workforce system is, what a workforce ecosystem is, and all the different factors that go into how well folks are able to navigate the local labor market. We know it's about the kind of jobs that exist. We know it's about, either on-ramps or barriers that folks face in trying to access employment, but it's also about how much is rent, in the city where jobs are growing. Do you have reliable, affordable, reasonable commutes to job centers? Do you have access to affordable childcare? And those are all just sort of the issues that happen even before you get in the door. We know that internal to companies and as an employee, there are a whole host of other issues. And so understanding the complexity of this, what does it mean to develop equity-driven strategies? So we can go through these. Next slide, Jonathan. Yeah, go if you want to go ahead and bring up the list. That's probably smart. So we believe that workforce equity strategies ought to be data-driven. We know that there are deep challenges that we're facing, and we need to be grounded in an understanding of both the historical context and also what are the challenges that we're dealing with right now. How are we going to measure the impact that we're having? How are we going to be accountable for whether or not those strategies are making the difference that we hope they will? And so having that data that both drives the development of the strategies to make sure that they're getting targeted to the right issues and to the right populations is a really key point. They obviously have to be race conscious. You can't have equity without racial equity. And so paying attention to the specificity of experiences that different groups of people face. We know that race is not the only thing that matters, but we believe the data bears out that it absolutely always matters. And so developing strategies that are conscious of that is important. You want to be outcomes oriented. What is the outcome? What is the result that we want to see for our communities? When we define workforce equity, we are talking about a statement of well-being for a community and for a labor force, right? That everybody has access to a good job. That's the outcome that we are working toward. They also need to be context specific. Clearly there are, and I'm sure you all could give me a list of these, there are some really big high level, maybe federal policies or sweeping changes that we know would make a difference in each of our communities. But even those things have to be locally contextualized and administered. The challenges that folks are facing in Boston are not the same challenges that they're facing in Detroit, right? And so understanding the context, not only in terms of what's happening within the labor market, but also the political will, the policy context that you're operating in, who are the various stakeholders and players that are already engaged in different ways. So there's a whole lot of things that context means that we want to take into consideration. And then finally, they ought to be actionable, right? Developing strategies that can actually be moved forward. And we know that this happens at a different pace, and it doesn't mean that you only go for the easy wins. But when we think about strategies at the end, we ought to understand what the steps are going to be to get there. And so this is just sort of the context of the way that we approach this. You can go to the next slide, please. All right, so how do we do that? Last week, we talked a lot about data. Today, there's going to be a more focused couple data points that we're going to look at, but how do you move from data to strategy? And we have basically a kind of 4-part system. The first that we're going to do today, first as a whole group, as an example, and then we'll do some breakout work in smaller groups, is to brainstorm what are the factors that are driving current outcomes. So we're going to be looking at the share of workers earning at least $15 an hour. And I'm going to invite you to help me think through, why is that the case? Why are we seeing the data that we're seeing in this chart that we're going to look at? There are systems, there are specific policies, there are behaviors, there are a whole range of things that we're going to brainstorm, some of which may be directly related to workforce, some of which may not. And so the second step, given that the workforce world is kind of the water that we're all swimming in, is to identify factors that are kind of in your lane or in your wheelhouse. So among all of those things, which are the ones that really exist within the workforce ecosystem that we might have some leverage to change? Next slide. And then next time in our final webinar of this series next week, we will be kind of moving on to the second part of this process, which is proposing strategies. What could be done or what's being done that could be tweaked and done differently to really change some of those key factors, right? So that we're changing things at the systems level. And then after we propose those strategies, there's a kind of robust process of assessment. Who's it going to work for? How big of an impact is it going to have? How likely are you able to move on it? Next slide. All right, so today we're going to just focus on those first 2 issues, those first two questions, starting with brainstorming the factors behind the data. So we're going to be looking at the share of workers earning $15 an hour. Next slide. And the lovely Houston region is going to be our example, our model for this. So I'm going to just kind of describe what I see here in this chart, and I'm going to go ahead and share in the chat a Google sheet that everyone should be able to see. The same chart is there, and then we'll be taking some notes on what the factors are. So this chart shows change over time in the share of workers who are earning at least $15 an hour by race ethnicity. So this is just a very, very broad disaggregation. The gray line that you see at the top shows the share of white workers in the Houston region earning $15 or more. And the orange line shows the share of workers of color owning $15 or more. So at first glance, we see that among white workers, that rate's pretty stable over the last several decades. This is adjusted for inflation, obviously, but that rate has been over 80% since 1980, a little bit of up and down, but pretty stable. For workers of color, it's actually declined over time, and there is a pretty sizable gap. So starting with a 17 percentage point gap in 1980, right now there is a 23 percentage point gap between these populations, between the share of workers earning $15 an hour or more. And so when we start to think about what are the factors that are resulting in the data that we see here, there are a few things we might want to look at. Number one, why is the gap so persistent and growing, right? That's one dynamic that we see. Number two, why isn't it higher for everyone, right? If we're thinking about all jobs being good jobs and family sustaining, the ultimate goal should be that both of these lines ought to eventually end up at 100%. So what are the factors that are keeping wages for everyone down? And then we might want to dig in more specifically, look at some more recent data to see how these things have changed in the last decade, looking at things like population change and demographic change to understand some of those dynamics. So if you want to just kind of give us a couple seconds on each of the next few slides, Jonathan. In the National Equity Atlas, you will see for our $15 an hour indicator, a lot of ways to cut this. This shows by race ethnicity. So instead of just having one line for people of color, this is going to show you the specific rates for Black workers, Latinx workers, Asian or Pacific Islander workers. So you can dig in a little more. Next slide. We can also look at this by gender. We know that gender inequities in pay are a big dynamic here. So this chart will show you the share of workers earning that wage by both race and gender. Next slide. We can look at this by educational attainment. So I'm sure that'll come up as one of the factors that might be driving the trend. And so you might want to understand how much does educational attainment affect the likelihood that a given worker will be earning $15 an hour. So here you can see the share of workers by both race and educational attainment. Next. And apart from just the cuts in our $15 an hour indicator, it might also be interesting to look, because we're viewing a trend over time, the population reflected in that trend is changing, right? So it might be important to understand, okay, over the last decade, how has the population grown? What has been the demographic change in Houston? And so you might want to look at some of our demographic indicators that show that for all groups except Native Americans, people of color, are the population is growing much more quickly than the white population. So that's another kind of dimension of this dynamic. Next. We don't have to talk about these in depth. I just like showing what's in the atlas. If you're thinking about that, there may also be a question around the age of workers. We know that workers who have been working longer tend to earn more money. So understanding the kind of age dynamics at work here, we have an indicator on the racial generation gap. So this shows that in 1980, just about 25% of seniors in Houston were people of color, but now that number's over 41%, while the percent of young people who are people of color has increased dramatically from 42% in 1980 to 72% in 2017. All right, next slide. So this is going to bring us back to where we started, which is just this general chart on the share of workers earning $15 an hour or more. So in the Google Doc, if you have that open, you'll see two columns. Column I in yellow are the kind of negative factors. In the language of factor analysis, if you're used to it, these are our contributing factors. And then column J in blue are the positive factors or restricting factors. So I would love to hear from you all if you want to put it in the chat. I think there are few enough of us that if you want to raise your hand or unmute yourself, we can have some conversation about this as well. So when we think about what are the causes, what are the root causes, what are the systems and dynamics and policies that are resulting in the outcome that we see here with this growing racial gap in the share of workers earning $15 an hour or more. I'm going to give folks just a minute to take this in, and then would love to see if you want to pop some ideas in the chat. You can also feel free to put them directly in the Google Doc, because I think we're all looking at that too. And I will kick us off by saying, I think part of the story here might have to do with the concentrated growth in low-wage jobs and industries. So industries and occupations that tend to pay less than $15 an hour. That's kind of an economic development cause. So I'm going to put growth in low-wage jobs as potentially a negative factor here. Another thing I happen to know about the state of Texas is that it preempts localities from establishing a local minimum wage that's higher than the state minimum wage. So I don't know enough about Houston to know whether or not that's something that the city would be likely to do, but I know in a place like Asheville, North Carolina, which also faces state preemption, the city wanted to raise the minimum wage and wasn't able to do so. They've thought of some really kind of interesting ways around that, actually, but I'm going to put, I'm going to not erase someone else's idea. I'm going to put in here state preemption as another factor. So someone said growth of the gig economy. I think that's absolutely true. State preemption. Maybe if we think about specifically the gap that we see between white workers and workers of color, why does that gap exist? I don't think anybody was probably surprised to see it, right? There's nothing about the data itself that's shocking, but why? Why is it this way? Reduced power of labor unions, educational attainment. Systemic racism in the chat, absolutely. What might that mean in this context? Can we get a little bit more specific? I think sometimes there are, these insights that are really true, but still a little bit hard to wrap your hands around. Lack of wage transparency for sure. And even just thinking about, straight up wage discrimination. There are specific employers who pay white workers differently than Black and Latinx and Native workers.
So Abbie, and just to be clear, so when we see things like white supremacy culture and systemic racism and your invitation to dig a little deep, in regards to workforce equity, like how does that manifest? Like how does that show up? So are you asking us to get a little more granular in that?
Yeah, so let's just, I think it's right. And part of the way that this process works the best is to, any one of the ideas that you all have put in the sheet or in the chat, I think are absolutely correct. And sometimes you want to just linger a little bit and think about how is it that white supremacy culture shows up here? What are the sort of ways that it manifests? Yeah. So we talked about wage discrimination. I'm sure there are plenty of other things as well.
It also shows up, it also shows up in terms of where, in transportation and where new businesses pop up, right? And so if they pop up out in areas that are not accessible to most folks, right?
Absolutely. Yeah, so we can think about geographic barriers to access transit. Yeah, we hear all the time talking to people who say, I finally got this opportunity that I wanted, that they've been working really hard to advance or to find a higher quality job, and then weren't able to take advantage of it because the buses weren't running at that time, or they couldn't afford the drive there and back, from the place where their rent is affordable to where there was a decent job opportunity to take advantage of. Gentrification, rising rents. So thinking about how all these systems fit together, you guys got this down. I think we have a good list here, and I might ask Jonathan to save the chat so we can make sure that everything's there, also ends up in the Google Sheet, because we want to make this available as a resource to you all as well. But before we move on, let's think for a minute, and it's harder, but I think we've been brainstorming a good list of the kind of negative factors. What do we think of are the positive factors? So how do we spin this? We do see from 2010 to 2017 this uptick in the share of workers of color from 58 to 61%. That's obviously not good enough, but the trend is moving in the right direction, right? So we don't see it declining any further. What are the factors that maybe are preventing this from getting worse, and that might have even started to show it ticking up a little bit? What do we think could explain that change from 2010 to 2017 for workers of color? I don't think there has been a public policy change in minimum wage, but there have been, several corporations, some like private policy, where big employers have said, we're going to go ahead and establish $15 as our wage floor. I think that's part of it. Probably doesn't explain the whole thing, but I'm going to put that as a positive factor. Anything else come to mind? Social media. Alexandra, could you say something more about that? Increased, And if not, that's okay. But that's fascinating to me. I'd love to hear your thoughts about social media. Okay, right. So that there are, maybe there's sort of a general growing sense of awareness, but also responsibility around some of these racial equity issues that affects wages and employment, as well as other areas. Sure. Increased focus on diversity, equity, and inclusion. Could the rise between 2010 be affected by losses of overall job availability and lower paying jobs? That's a great question. Yeah. So I think that Matt pointed out something that you have to be careful doing this, right? Because sometimes there are dynamics that are not good that might actually make the data look a little bit better. So this chart doesn't tell us anything about how many people in Houston actually have jobs. Right. And so it could be that if there were a significant number of low wage workers of color who lost their jobs, that alone would make it look like a greater share of them were earning more than $15 an hour. So sometimes you got to be careful. The indicator that this always happens to for me is school poverty. So school poverty is measured by the number of students in a school who qualify for free or reduced price lunch. And there have been several jurisdictions that have said, look, if a certain number of kids get free or reduced price lunch, we're just going to give it to everybody. So that makes it look like there are many more children in high poverty schools. What's actually happened is many more children are actually getting access to nutritious food at lunch. We want to see that, even though it makes the data look worse. So I think, Matt's pointing out one of the things that makes this a little tricky, and why, we set aside an hour to kind of walk through this process. It takes a little more time than that to really dig in. But I'm loving that this is always the hardest part for me, and you guys are kind of killing it. So worker strikes and worker power, worker organizing. Certainly coming from 2010 to 2017 in particular, we were coming out of a recession. And so seeing that recovery and job growth for sure. Yeah, so I think as far as how this works, you guys got it down. So Jonathan, can you go to the next slide? So one of the factors that came up was educational attainment as explaining this as being one factor contributing to the gap here. We know that white workers tend to have higher educational attainment than workers of color, so that might be given as a reason. But I'm not going to talk through all these. You can just kind of go down to the breakout group instructions, Jonathan, and I'll just share a little bit. But we know that educational attainment itself, that might be listed as one factor here, but it requires its own whole factor analysis. Why is it that white workers are so much more likely to have higher education? And then we get into issues around school poverty, we get into issues around cost, we get into issues of generational wealth, right? So any of these factors that you come up with, it's kind of like a rabbit hole, that you can end up going down. And that's one of the reasons why we say do the brainstorming, do the big systems level thinking, but then take a moment and kind of come back to focus on what are the real workforce factors that you're identifying? What are the things that fit kind of squarely within the workforce ecosystem? So we've just gone through this together, I think, really efficiently, and around wages. Now what we're going to do is go into some breakout groups, and basically repeat the same thing for unemployment. So when we talk about closing wage gaps and closing employment gaps, we just talked about wages. Now we're going to talk about employment. So Jonathan's going to randomly assign each of you to a group, and we'll take about 15 minutes. You'll notice in that same Google Sheet that I shared, there are tabs at the bottom for whatever group you end up in, whatever your group number is. All of the groups are looking at unemployment data, but I pulled it for different regions because they each have a little bit different story, a little bit different shape. And so when you get into your group, it would be great if, we're all adults, and I think can self-organize. If someone wants to kind of facilitate discussion, and if someone could be responsible for recording and reporting what your group comes up with, that would be great. We'll actually have 15 minutes for you to do this factor analysis, and then we'll all come back together and share what you came up with. Does anybody have any questions about that? Anybody need the link again? All right, let me put the link back in the chat here. All right.
Jo, do we still have a few people that need to go into a group?
So there's a couple folks. I see 3 folks who haven't joined their groups yet.
So Enrique, Karen, and Ashley, if you guys can join your group. Can you put them in the group?
I don't know if I can put them in their group, but can y'all just accept I'll resend the groups for you all.
I wonder if they just have they're just signed in, but not actually here. JL, how do I pop around?
So if you open up breakout rooms at the bottom or on the more, you can.
Okay. And so
Isn't
will
it
you
too,
give?
but trying to figure out how do I join it and then get back?
Yeah, so you want to like go on breakout rooms, and then you
Can
go
go
to the
to-
room and it'll have like the join. So you'd see where everybody is located. You just jump in and join.
Oh, I see. It's hidden. Okay.
Yeah. Just click over the number.
So literally half the call dropped off once we went to breakout rooms. Interesting.
Yeah.
Michelle, I might join room 2 since they are down to 2
Yeah.
people.
No,
And I might just stay with them.
Okay.
And room 3 and 4 might need some assistance.
Okay. I'll go to room 3. And how I just click on the 3? I just click on it, JL? On here. And JL, if you want to give them a time check and like when we have about 5 minutes left. Okay, so I'm clicking on room 3, JL, but I'm not actually in it. Where did JL go? Are you back, Jo?
Yep.
Man, that dropped off dramatically when we went to the small groups, huh?
Yeah, I don't know if everybody was ready for a more interactive. Yeah.
What time did you gave them? What warning did you give them?
I just gave a 1 minute left in breakout rooms warning.
Okay. So we should probably get on the calendar this week so we can, is the website ready to review? I'll see everybody's starting to return back into the space. Do we have everybody? Welcome back, everybody. So Jo, so what we want to spend the remaining time that we have with you all, we want to know, and I will invite you just to come off of mute and just speak a little bit about what that experience was like for you, what worked, what didn't work, what questions you might have. So let's do some sharing.
I have to say that I so enjoyed going into the breakout room and being able to talk through this and think through this. And I immediately started writing down like how I might want to do that same kind of brainstorming in the different circles that I get to sit in as we kind of sit with the data and brainstorm around it. It just felt really valuable, and it was very helpful to kind of model it. And I thought it was helpful when I was looking and we were doing it as a group, but it was so much more helpful to go in the breakout room and kind of force us to go through the process. So that's not so much like the specifics of our case, but I see Alexandra nodding, who was in our breakout room, and it just felt great to have to dive in and go through that. And I could see taking that back to the circles where I work. So thank you for that.
No, that's great feedback. And that's good to hear, because a lot of, we noticed like a lot of folks dropped off. We went to the small breakouts, like, oh, okay, so they're not a fan of the breakouts. But I'm glad you had a positive experience with that. So that's good. What else came up for you in doing that exercise?
By the way, can I also just note, I found it a little uncomfortable to make certain assumptions about like where certain groups might be. I mean, to say like people of color and educational attainment, I mean, we know these things. Sometimes we think we do, right? But it really, I felt very uncomfortable kind of stating some of these, not so much like just speaking more broadly, like we said, oh, there was an economic downturn at this point. Look how we're seeing that and see how it disproportionately affects people of color. That's one thing. But then to kind of go into assumptions about, white versus people of color and where that falls, it just felt, I don't know if other people felt the same way, but just it feels very uncomfortable to be like pulling out what could quite frankly be stereotypes that aren't necessarily grounded in data, because we're looking at kind of one graph and trying to understand what the factors are. And I could see that going very wrong in brainstorming if I were to kind of do that, and go through that exercise in other places. Anyway, just.
Yeah, Abbie, I will say, I think that's common. I think that's a common reaction. And so I did it a little backwards, but I think one suggestion you might want to think about is have that data available and maybe kind of show those pieces first before you go into the kind of broad level factor analysis, so that it is grounded in data, so that people do have something to reference. Oftentimes when I start this exercise, the critique that I get that's totally valid is this isn't disaggregated enough. You can't just talk about the white experience and then the experience of everyone else. Totally true. However, trying to do this first step of the work with 7 lines on that graph instead of 2 is more than most people are, ready to dive into. But you could show some of that educational attainment data. You could show the specific numbers for different groups ahead of time to kind of give people that context and fodder, and to nuance a little bit the question that we're asking, which feels a little bit like a sledgehammer instead of a scalpel.
Right. And I think the other part of that, Abbie, is that it's also about the system that's contributing to these numbers, like how what systems are operating that these things are in place. So not as much making assumptions about the people, but why is it, what systems are in place that this particular population can't do. I use community colleges, for example, in North Carolina. One of the childcare programs, daycare programs are readily available, right? And they fill community colleges with students and those programs pretty much fund some of the math and science programs, like the engineering programs or the nursing programs, but they have restrictions on who can get into those programs, right? So you have to have certain scores around math and science to get into some of those STEM programs, and it's a limited capacity. And so even though it's being funded by students who are pushed into one group, they also don't have access to the higher end, the higher wage programs, training programs, right? And so that's the system. So why is that? Why is the system set up that way, right? Like if you look at that as a contributing factor to some of the issues. So that's where you're really digging in on that. Like, why are these people? Why does this group not have access to this particular resource?
I was thinking, as the two Abbies were having an earlier conversation too, kind of that broad brush. And if you kind of think about positive, negatives, and then you disaggregate and see if those things still hold true. Or, were you making assumptions with the broad stroke, but now as you disaggregate that by gender, by educational level, do all those things still hold true? And again, back to the earlier, as you were talking about the kind of those equity strategies about being race conscious, if it still holds true, even when you disaggregate by these 8 other layers, if it's still there, then that kind of reemphasizes, yep, race is let's get back to one of that strategy, right? So I think it was very helpful.
And I mean, I know we do a slide with where you do that base level layout, but then you talk like the 7 line, and you do a deeper dive, a deeper cut into more disaggregated data when you go across race, ancestry, and ethnicity. And Seattle always pops up for us because that seems to be one of the more stark examples, right? When you start digging down into that, right? And even when we were doing our report work with Seattle, we had a line on there on Black Americans, and they asked us to ask you guys to come back and do a different cut, because they needed to see that ancestry in that, because they knew about some of the exclusionary practices for people once you dig down into that to the next layer, right? So,
right. And when you start asking those questions, which is why I say any answer you give, you should immediately question, right? Ask why, ask those deeper questions. So, when we look at any given indicator where you might see different outcomes just between Black and white, there are different ways to dig in there around gender, around nativity. There are, there are a diversity of immigrant experiences that can also be kind of invisibilized or kind of couched under those top line indicators that we want to make sure we can get to. There are communities, Middle Eastern and North African communities, who are reported within white outcomes. That's how the data is structured. But when we disaggregate by ancestry, you can see that even within that group, there is a broad range of experiences and a broad range of inequities. The same holds true almost everywhere we look for the Asian or Pacific Islander community. It is tremendously diverse. There are so many experiences, so many different outcomes. And so being able, asking those why questions can help you maybe uncover where there's something that you might be missing, and where there might be, some issues that you think, oh, we don't have to worry about them. The top line, they're doing okay. Maybe not all of whoever them is in that line of data is actually experiencing that positive outcome. And so, so this is a little bit of it's a difficult exercise for folks in some ways, the kind of work that it asks you to do, but I do think that it can be really helpful. Just reiterating that you always want to make sure, and if you're engaging other folks in this kind of thing, reassure them that we're going to come back around to, okay, but what can we control, right? We were having a conversation about transportation equity, and then all of a sudden, how did we end up trying to resolve redlining and reparations? Yes, those things matter and they're contributing, and we're going to get back to doing our work and let this influence it and inform it.
So just looking at the time, so we're at 2:56. I'll give a few seconds if anybody has any, if there are any questions or any additional comments, and then we'll just wrap up and prep for next week.
So I do have something I want to say, and so you see the data, right? And I think Abbie talked a little bit about assumptions. You don't necessarily want to make an assumption. But the one thing that I'm learning about, the National Fund is that the individuals and the organizations that are a part of these conversations are really dedicating themselves to change the landscape of how we do business and how we do work. The question that I have, when we have this type of data, how do we bring it and present it to a group of individuals who's not necessarily interested in changing the landscape? How do we allow them to assume things? Because it's not that they're just living in their truth, right? It's okay for them to live in their truth. And if they don't know it, then it's okay. But how do we bring this to the conversation to actually get them to at least hear us out, at least think about processes and policies so that we can better serve those that we are working with?
That is a fantastic question. And I'm looking at Caitlin, who's shaking her head like she knows she knows that she knows this challenge. We all know this challenge. So part of it is understanding who your stakeholders are and where the spheres of influence lie, right? And so one of the things that we do and what we did with the workforce equity, the Advancing Workforce Equity Initiative, is when the folks were convening their groups, is that we asked them to identify folks who were decision makers, influencers, or connectors, right? Like those are the only folks that we really wanted at the table, because we need those folks, people who are decision makers, influencers, or connectors, to be able to push that message out, right? So part of it is strategizing along that, and also, at the National Fund, and this is certainly PolicyLink's mantra as well too, special Michael McAfee, right? Like, so we, and Angela Glover Blackwell, you work with who wants to do the work, right? And then everybody else, like you just gotta go. And so, and we can talk about that, dig into that a little more next week when we talk about the messiness of this work, because this is one part of it, but you bring up the human element, and that's something that you can't shake, but it does need to be addressed. So that's a really great question, and I would love to put a little bit of time to that next week to talk about that. And so, speaking of next week, does that work for you, Marquise?
Yes.
Okay. So next week, we will have one of our Advancing Workforce Equity collaboratives on the webinar to present their strategies in their slide deck. And we will also spend a little time talking about the stakeholder piece. And we also will just show you the beta version of the Advancing Workforce Equity Toolkit, which our 5 collaboratives participated in. Caitlin was a part of that as well too. Thank you, Caitlin, for being on the call. Show you guys that, and then we'll also make sure that the resource packet is available and see if there are any other questions there. So we'll dig into that. So as Jonathan said to me, shout out to the folks who stayed on the call and went through the activity. But we are at time. I appreciate you deep. You guys have a fantastic afternoon, and we look forward to seeing you next week.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye.
The registration link in the chat.